Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Daniel Anderson. I'm a student at Hillsdale College, and I'm participating in the Washington Hillsdale Internship Program this semester, interning at FreedomWorks. I would like to introduce Dr. Ronald J. Pestritto. He is the Charles and Lucia Shipley Chair in the American Constitution, Associate Professor of Politics, and Dean of the Graduate School of Statesmanship at Hillsdale College. He also is Senior Fellow with Hillsdale Kirby Center. Having earned his BA at the Claremont McKenna College and his MA and PhD in political science from the Claremont Graduate University, Dr. Pestritto is Senior Fellow at the Claremont Institute and an Academic Fellow of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. He is author or editor of 7 books, including Woodrow Wilson and the Roots of Modern Liberalism and American Progressivism, a Reader. Now please join me in welcoming Dr. Pestritto.
All right, well, good afternoon. It's great to be here at the Kirby Center. Thanks to everybody for coming out, and thanks to everybody tuning in online. I guess tuning in is the right phrase online, although I'm a bit old-fashioned, so pardon me if that's not the way to put it. But I'm also in the unenviable position of coming after Dr. Kevin Porteous, whose presentation this morning I thought was great, and I fear how I may look by comparison, but I'll do my best. As Dr. Porteous explained in the presentation, concluded in the presentation, the administrative state that we have today very much stands in sharp contrast with the principles of constitutional government, and in fact, Senator Lee made much the same case in his remarks earlier. In fact, while today the legislative and the executive branches of our national government remain stalemated and divided, the bureaucracy keeps on going, keeps on churning along. And the bureaucracy really is where almost all of the relevant activity is today in government. Now, we know that in our system, Congress may make the laws, but over the last century or so, these laws have often been written so vaguely, so broadly, that the real policy making has been done, or is largely done, by bureaucrats in those agencies that our laws have created for the purpose of implementing and administering the details. The examples of this scenario are, of course, abundant. We don't need to go deeply into them. Dr. Porteous cited several of them in his remarks earlier, but I just want to give you a couple quick ones to underscore the point, and really to get us started in figuring out where it is and how it is all of this came to happen in American history, which is really my task today. Dr. Porteous mentioned our friends in the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, and the EPA is, of course, presently in the process of issuing final rules regulating greenhouse gases, among other things. Now, due mostly to the concern over impacts that such regulations would have on the economy, you may recall that a similar scheme of regulation garnered strong bipartisan opposition in the last Congress and failed to pass. In fact, you may remember that then Senate candidate Joe Manchin won election from the state of West Virginia, due in part to a television commercial which showed him or depicted him shooting a copy of the legislation with a high-powered rifle. So that's how unpopular this was. However, in spite of this legislative failure, in spite of it being rejected by your elected representatives, these rules, and many like them, are right now in the process of becoming law. Such a maneuver is, of course, possible because when Congress enacted the Clean Air Act and its subsequent amendments, it defined the EPA's power in such broad and vague terms that it amounted to a delegation of the very legislative power that is supposed to, according to the Constitution, lie only with Congress. It was given to the agency. In a similar example, this is one that hasn't been mentioned yet today, we know that Congress back in 2008 considered and voted down a taxpayer-funded bailout of major American automobile manufacturers. Nonetheless, as you may have noticed, Treasury Department went right ahead and proceeded to bail out both General Motors and Chrysler. How did this happen? It was able to do so because in the previously enacted Troubled Asset Relief Program legislation, TARP, which was supposedly passed for the purpose of bailing out banks and other financial services entities, that law had been written so vaguely that the Treasury Department, under its terms, had ample discretion to divert funds to a wide array of activities that had little or nothing to do with the financial services industry, just the way the law was written. Same kind of lawmaking by unelected bureaucrats, of course, is a central piece of Obamacare, and Dr. Porteous went through a lot of the details there. And if you think about the Obamacare legislation, as long as it really is true. It doesn't say much. It just confers power on various parts of the federal bureaucracy. Just this past week, of course, we know that, as it has played out in the news, the Obama administration has pressed its assault on religious liberty in this country. And it's done so through the bureaucracy, by issuing rules through the Department of Health and Human Services that require private entities, even religiously affiliated entities like Catholic schools and hospitals, requires them to pay for services through Obamacare that are fundamentally at odds with the tenets of their faith. Now, there's a big uproar about this, but whom do we hold accountable? After all, the people of this country don't vote for the bureaucrats that issued those rules, and thus can't hold them directly accountable. Nonetheless, these rules, of course, have the force of law. They are, in fact, the functional equivalent of laws. Just try violating one of them, you will find this out very quickly. Again, in a way, the temptation is to demonize the bureaucracy. I'm all for that, of course, but Congress really is responsible. Right? Congress really is responsible. Congress passed a piece of legislation, in this case the Obamacare legislation, that was so vague, so broad, it essentially pushed lawmaking power over into the bureaucracy. And so rules which now will deeply affect the health of all Americans, never mind their religious liberties, they are going to be made and are being made at a furious pace by a collection of bureaucrats who are largely insulated from direct public accountability. Kind of makes you wonder why people get all worked up about elections in this country if in the end they may not matter that much. Well, this was not the system that our founders established. For the founders, who wanted to secure individual rights, they implemented a constitutional design centered on separation of powers. In fact, Senator Lee outlined some of this morning. Fundamental aim of separation of powers was to safeguard the natural rights of citizens, to safeguard them against the possibility of arbitrary government. This essentially was the point of the remarks by Dr. Porteous and Senator Lee this morning. Just talk briefly then about a couple of them. We'll talk about first the principle of non-delegation. It's very straightforward. If the separation of powers means anything at all, it means that one branch of government may not have the bulk of its powers exercised by another branch. If you have that, you don't have separation of powers. Pretty simple. Second one, closely related to that first one. No combination of functions, no combination of powers within a single agency, within a single set of hands. Think about this a little further. Those making the law should also be subject to the law being enforced upon them by an independent authority. It's one of the fundamental safeguards of our liberty, right? I know when I'm voting for a law, this thing's going to be enforced on me too. Right? That's important. Those involved then in executing the law can't make up the law as they go. They don't get to decide what the rules are on the spot and then enforce them on you in an arbitrary way. Right? Instead, they have to enforce laws that have been previously established by a separate authority. That would mean, for instance, that when the Department of HHS goes about implementing Obamacare, they shouldn't first get to make up the rules that they're then going to implement. It's pretty fundamental. And finally, under this principle of separation of powers, those on whom the law is enforced can then have their cases judged by an authority entirely separate from that which brought the prosecution. Now, from what we've heard today, we know that those basic common sense, essential constitutional principles stand in sharp contrast to the way in which bureaucracies exercise real power. First, there is the basic and unavoidable fact that the administrative state today is built on governance by expertise at the expense of government by consent. And thus lawmaking power is delegated away from our elected representatives over to unelected so-called experts. Second, look at the combination of functions within single agencies. Dr. Porteous read that great description of the Federal Trade Commission written by Gary Lawson. You could apply that description to many of our federal agencies today. Bear that in mind. Many of them exercise lawmaking, executive, and judicial functions all at once. Particularly, this is true of our so-called independent regulatory commissions. The National Labor Relations Board, for instance, has been in the news much lately, and that's how the NLRB functions, essentially. So we have all these fundamental differences between the founders' constitutionalism and the principles of our administrative state today, and thus the question should arise, how did this happen? How did this happen? How did we get to this point? How did the move from the principles of our founding to the modern administrative state occur? Well, it's a long and complicated story. I think I've only got 5 or 6 hours, so I'll try to, only an hour. Okay, well, I'll just give you one important part of the answer, and that, of course, lies in the American progressive movement. American progressive movement came to its height at the turn of the 20th century, and really it had become impatient with the limits imposed on the federal government by the Constitution. Now, in order to handle the vast array of new redistributive and regulatory activities that progressives had in mind for the national government, it was necessary to erode those constitutional limits. It was necessary also to come up with an administrative system that was actually capable of managing this whole new set of federal programs and endeavors. We didn't have the apparatus in place at the time. And it shouldn't surprise us that those calling themselves progressives today remain strongly attached to this kind of discretionary expert governance that had in fact been launched by their ancestors in the original progressive movement. This idea that we get in modern bureaucracy, again, was outlined by some of our speakers this morning, of taking a significant portion of government and grounding it not on the basis of popular consent, but on the basis of expertise. This was a fundamental aim of American progressivism. It helps to explain the progressives' fierce assault on the founders' separation of powers constitutionalism. This idea was introduced into the United States by progressive reformers who had themselves learned the principle from what was then the cutting-edge theory of history and of the state, which had been developed in 19th century Germany. And in this regard, no one, I think, was more important to the origins of the administrative state in America than the two figures that I wanted to say something about today in the remainder of my remarks. One you no doubt have heard of, and one probably you have not. So let me start with the one that you've probably heard of, Woodrow Wilson. Wilson, of course, served as the 28th President of the United States. He had been also a leading academic advocate of progressive ideas long before his entry into politics. A lot of people don't understand how active and how prolific an academic Wilson was for decades prior to his entry into public life. In fact, much of his contribution to progressive thought came in the 1880s through a series of important essays and speeches that he gave. This idea of taking administration, taking agencies, taking bureaucracies, and shielding them at least to some degree from political influence, right? Getting them out of being subject directly to the consent of the governed, in other words. This had been around, of course, in the United States for some time, at least since the reaction against the 19th century spoil system. Right? This is the case in which many jobs in the federal bureaucracy were doled out on the basis of one's affiliation with a particular party or candidate, and not very much based on the person's actual skill or merit. So you had the establishment of the Civil Service Commission under the Pendleton Act in 1883. This marked a significant victory for opponents of the spoil system. However, it really took the progressives, starting with Woodrow Wilson and Frank Goodnow, who's the other figure I'm going to talk to you about in a moment, to take this rather narrow inclination from the civil service reform movement, right, which is basically we want to kind of cleanse politics we want to get it out of administration, purify administration, clean it up. It took the progressives to take that little inclination and turn it into a much bigger, broader, thoughtful critique, comprehensive critique of American constitutionalism, and really part of a broader argument for political reform. Now, while the opponents of the spoils system certainly wanted to shield administration from political cronyism, they really didn't offer a new theory of administration itself. Instead, it was the progressives. And they were concerned less with eradicating the evils of political cronyism, although that was a problem, than they were in creating a realm of neutral administrative discretion, shielded from direct political accountability. Now, Woodrow Wilson introduced this concept of separating politics and administration, of treating administrative governance and everything involved in it as an object of study entirely separate from politics, from constitutional governance. And he introduced it in a series of essays in the late part of the 1880s. Frank Goodnow then expanded on this Wilsonian concept in the 1890s. And eventually published a book in 1900 titled Politics and Administration. By the way, if you're ever having trouble sleeping, you might pick up a copy. It's better than any pill you can take. The fundamental assumption behind the vast discretion that progressives wanted to give to administration was this: it was a trust in, or an optimism about, the selflessness, the competence, the objectivity, and the capability of administrators. And therefore, a belief that the separation of powers checks on government were really no longer necessary, and really no longer just. So if you think about the framers of the Constitution instituted the separation of powers out of fear of the abuses of government, fear that the permanent self-interestedness in human nature that they thought was there could make government a threat to the natural rights of citizens. So if that's what the framers thought, then the advocates of administrative discretion concluded that those fears, even if they had been well-founded at the time, right, given the history of the founding era, really no longer applied in the modern era, in their time. Therefore, they argued administration could now be freed from the shackles which had been placed upon it by the separation of powers, and it needed to be freed in order to take on the new tasks that progressives had in mind for the national state. This key assumption behind this idea of separating politics and administration is very much exemplified in Wilson's political thought. There's a strong progressive belief in the Enlightenment, in the disinterestedness of administrators, which stood as an instructive contrast to the permanent self-interestedness that the framers of the U.S. Constitution saw in human nature. If you think of that famous passage from Federalist 10, where Madison talks about the latent causes of faction being sown in the nature of man, and thus the limits on government must be permanent as well. That's the contrast here. So we've got this sobriety about the potential for tyranny that led the framers to circumscribe carefully the authority of government, versus the progressives' passionate optimism. Right? And their passionate optimism fueled their call for the maximum discretion for administrators. Now, we have to be careful here. We don't want to suggest that somehow the framers of the Constitution denied discretionary power to the national government. Far from it. Right? Certainly no reader of Federalist Paper number 23 or many other Federalist papers I could point to, no reader could reasonably draw such a conclusion. Rather, the framers understood that such discretion, while occasionally necessary, had to be channeled through the forms and through the law of the Constitution in order to be safe for liberty. Therefore, as Alexander Hamilton explained in Federalist number 23 and elsewhere, the vigorous discretion that the national government needed to have was to be made safe by, quote, the most vigilant and careful attention of the people. The most vigilant and careful attention of the people, end quote. Now, how do the people go about exercising that vigilance? Well, the officers who exercise the discretion on their behalf must be made to do so in a system of clear electoral accountability. That's the only way it can work, within the confines of the rule of law, within the constitutional framework. And it is precisely that kind of political accountability, your ability to change what bureaucrats do through voting, that kind of accountability that progressives wanted. They wanted to free administrators from that. That was the problem from the point of view of the progressives. For the progressives, there was something special about civil servants. It somehow raised them above the ordinary self-interestedness of human nature. Now, such confidence came from a faith that progressives had in the power of history. Okay? The idea that history had elevated public servants to a level of objectivity. Our bureaucrats would supposedly be able to disregard their own private or particular inclinations in order to dedicate themselves to the objective good. And because of this disinterestedness, then, restraints on their discretion were no longer necessary. Now, Wilson subscribed thoroughly to this doctrine of historical progress. He learned it from reading German state theorists like Georg Hegel and Johann Blümschli, among others, and from his own teachers, like Richard T. Ely, who himself had received his education in Germany. Wilson came to believe, essentially, that history had solved the problem of faction, right? In direct opposition to Madison's claim that the causes of faction are sown there permanently in the nature of man. Wilson believes in the power of history. History has helped us overcome that. Right? Therefore, human nature is no longer a danger in democratic government. Wilson wrote frequently that the power of the national government could be unfettered because one faction or one part of the country was no longer a threat to the rights of another. Our real problem, Wilson argued, was not majority tyranny, but minority tyranny. Now, with the threat of faction having receded as a result of historical progress, Wilson argued that a new understanding then of the ends and scope of government was in order. This new understanding required an evolutionary approach to reading the Constitution, one in which the ends and scope of government are determined not so much by looking to the pre-established law of the Constitution, not to its original intent, not to what's written there, but instead to the new demands which were being placed upon the government by contemporary historical circumstances, and the Constitution had to be adapted accordingly. For example, in his campaign in 1912, which ran under the banner of the New Freedom, Wilson urged that the rigid, mechanical, what he called the Newtonian constitutional system be replaced by, quote, the Darwinian perspective. Right? That we ought to adjust the Constitution, we ought to see it as an organic entity, and it ought to be made to fit the ever-changing environment, constantly adapting to its environment, right? Hence the Darwinian label. Wilson also blamed the separation of powers theory for getting in the way of that new reading of the Constitution that he believed was necessary. It's making the national government unable to handle the tasks that history now requires of it and that the people want it to take on. This is what Wilson said on the campaign trail in 1912, quoting, "The trouble with the theory," and this is the theory of separation of powers, "the trouble with the theory is that government is not a machine but a living thing. It falls not under the theory of the universe, but under the theory of organic life. It is accountable to Darwin, not to Newton. It is modified by its environment, necessitated by its tasks, shaped to its functions by the sheer pressure of life. No living thing can have its organs offset against each other as checks and live." And then it's a central part of the speech he gave on the stump in 1912. So Wilson saw the separation of powers as a hindrance to efficiency. Right? Efficiency was to be valued over everything else, efficiently translating perceived majority opinion immediately into public policy. As Wilson claimed in 1885, efficiency had become the preeminent principle in government because history had brought us to an age where administrative functions of government were most important. This is what Wilson wrote then, quote, "The period of constitution making is past now. We have reached a new territory in which we need new guides, the vast territory of administration." That's where the real action was in government coming up into the future, which is sort of remarkable if you think what I said at the beginning of my remarks, that this is where the action is today, in the bureaucracy, even though bureaucracy doesn't sound like something very exciting to talk about. Woodrow Wilson, at least, should get excited about bureaucracy. In the various works that he wrote on administration, and which I should add, were largely responsible for launching the whole discipline of public administration in this country. And you still see lots of discussions about Wilson and Wilson's administrative theory in all the public administration literature. But in those works, Wilson's thesis was that it was far better, far more efficient for a professional class of experts instead of a multiplicity of politicians with narrow competing interests. Far better for that expert class to handle the complex business of the modern state. Now, to the objection that one might make, you might say, well, gosh, entrusting administrators with such discretion doesn't seem to comport with the Constitution's distribution of power. Right? To that objection, Wilson responded that administrative principles and constitutional principles were distinct, and thus that constitutional limitations could not easily be applied to the exercise of administrative power. That administration really lie outside the bounds of constitutional restraint. So you might be able to apply the separation of powers to the political branches, but that shouldn't be applied over to administration. So you take checks and balances, for example, that interferes with efficiency. It shouldn't be applied to the exercise of administrative power. Wilson wrote, quote, "Give us administrative elasticity and discretion, free us from the idea that checks and balances are to be carried down through all stages of organization." Now, this argument that freeing administrators from close political control, it was grounded in the characteristic progressive confidence in the expertness and objectivity of the administrative class. For years, Wilson had been urging special education for future administrators at the elite universities. He referred to the patriotism of administrators, to the, quote, disinterested ambition of the new administrative class. And he says this will come out of our elite universities. Right? Wilson himself, of course, was a Princeton alum. Wilson is thus a critical figure for the progressive vision of administration because he's largely responsible for applying optimism about administrators to the American system. Wilson assumed, just as the German thinker Hegel had assumed, that if you took an administrator and gave him a secure position, give him tenure, give him good pay, insulate him from political machinations, this would relieve that civil servant of his natural self-interestedness. So the particular narrow things with which he might be concerned, those would be taken care of. Then he would be free to do the public good, and that's what he would focus on. Now, his model, Wilson's model for this rather interesting conception of administrators, he freely acknowledged was almost entirely foreign to American constitutionalism. He acknowledges this. Yet it was his own notion of the distinction between administration and politics that made this okay, right? That made it okay, essentially, to import what was essentially a Prussian model of administrative governance into the United States. He was a great admirer of the Prussian bureaucracy. Precisely because, under his vision, administration was to be insulated from politics and was to be insulated from the Constitution, an administrative system that had come from a monarchy could be brought into the American Republic without harming our republican institutions. Right? If you keep administration separate, then why do we care what system our administrative model came from? Right? So as Wilson asked in his hugely influential essay titled The Study of Administration, he asked the following, quote, "Why should we not use such parts of foreign contrivances as we want if they be in any way serviceable? We are in no danger of using them in a foreign way. We borrowed rice, but we do not eat it with chopsticks," end quote. That essay is chock full of such allegedly witty remarks. Again, another cure for insomnia. If the politics and administration doesn't do it, Wilson's study of administration, that's the heavy dose. So Wilson knew, therefore, he knew that his vision for administration was a novelty in America. In fact, when he later taught administration in the 1890s, he said that there really was only one author, other than himself, who understood administration in this way, who understood administration as a separate discipline, not subject to politics, and that was Frank Goodnow, this other fellow I want to talk about. Now, Frank Goodnow produced almost all of his important work while a professor at Columbia University. He had been brought there by his mentor, a guy by the name of John Burgess, to teach political science and law. And really, he became there the first to teach administrative law in the United States. Prior to teaching at Columbia, Goodnow had spent a year studying in France and Germany, as I mentioned, and he would go on to finish his career, by the way, at Johns Hopkins, where he served as president, in fact, until his retirement in 1929. He was also the first president of the American Political Science Association. So a very influential intellectual, largely obscure to sort of the common history. Now, although Goodnow was a student of Burgess, he was certainly much more radical than Burgess in his progressivism. Goodnow looked for ways that American national government could be modified to accommodate progressive policy aims. And he thought that the goal could best be accomplished by freeing administration to manage the broad scope of affairs that progressives believed needed government intervention. Like Wilson, Goodnow argued that government needed to adjust its very purpose, its very organization, to accommodate modern necessities. And like Wilson, he believed that history had made obsolete the founders' dedication to protecting individual rights and had made obsolete their consequent design of this carefully limited form of national government. So in his book titled Social Reform and the Constitution, Goodnow complained about reverence for constitutional law, which he regarded as, quote, superstitious. He regarded it as an obstacle to genuine political and administrative reform. In his book titled Politics and Administration, Goodnow made clear that his push for administrative reform was not simply, or was not even primarily, aimed at correcting the corruption of the spoils system. That's all well and good, but that's not what this is about, Goodnow said. Rather, administrative reform was instrumental to the end of achieving progressive big government liberalism. Right? That's what this is about. If we don't enlarge the discretion of our administrative apparatus, if we don't free it from political control, then our government will be incapable of doing the kinds of things that we progressives have in mind. Right? If we're going to get what we want, we need the kind of government that's built to do it. We need to remove these limits. That's the bottom line for these guys. Now, if we understand administrative reform that way, as a means to securing the broader aims of progressive liberalism, that is what makes the work of Goodnow and Wilson, too, certainly, so much more significant to the development of modern American thought and politics than had been the case with the civil service reformers. Goodnow and his fellow progressives envisioned an almost entirely new purpose for the federal government. And thus government itself needed to be viewed through an historical lens. The principles of the original Constitution, Goodnow reasoned, may have been appropriate for the founding era, but now, he says, quote, under the present conditions, they are working harm rather than good, end quote. And again, the error that the founders made was not in constructing government as they did, but rather in taking their construction and thinking it would transcend their own age, and thinking it was appropriate not just for their time, but for all time, and thinking that this idea of human nature, right, was permanent as opposed to evolving. Essentially, the founders, from the point of view of the progressives, did not realize the historical contingency, the historical dependence of their views, that their views were only coming out of the conditions of their own day and thus couldn't be brought forward into other eras. Modern situation, according to Goodnow, called for less focus on constitutional principle. It called instead for a much greater focus on empowering and perfecting administration. He even repeated, using almost the same words, Wilson's proclamation from 1885, that the nation had to move from constitutional to administrative questions. So if you take the founders' constitutionalism and its focus on government's permanent duty to protect individual rights, they thought this was an impediment, this was the problem, this is the obstacle to the marked expansion of government that we progressives desire. And so if that's the problem, then that idea has to be discredited. Okay? Goodnow, Wilson, the progressives, they understood the political theory of the founding very well. They were well-educated men. They knew that this idea that the government's primary duty is to protect natural rights, they knew it came from this theory of social compact. Right? That's a theory, think of the Declaration of Independence, of course, which held that men are naturally endowed with rights prior to the formation of government. And therefore, their consent is required to create government. And they only consent to government insofar as it will protect their natural rights. This idea, Goodnow acknowledged, quote, was permeated by the theories of social compact and natural right, end quote, and he condemned those theories as, quote, worse than useless, since they, quote, retard development. Right? So the focus on individual liberty prevents the expansion of government. That's the bottom line. Take the separation of powers, its limits on government. Those come from this founding era concern for individual liberty, and thus Goodnow offers instead a critique of that idea based on historical contingency, based on historical evolution. That was then, this is now, new historical circumstances beget new principles. Now, instead of understanding rights grounded in nature, where the individual possesses them prior to the formation of government, right, where God gives you your rights, not government, Goodnow urged an understanding of rights that are in fact granted by government itself. Goodnow remarked favorably upon European trends. In those trends, the understanding of rights was contingent upon government. Here's Goodnow in 1916 commenting favorably on the idea of rights which was then current in Europe. Quote, "The rights which an individual possesses are, it is believed, conferred upon him not by his creator, but rather by the society to which he belongs. What they are, what your rights are, what they are is to be determined by the legislative authority in view of the needs of that society. Social expediency, rather than natural right, is thus to determine the sphere of individual freedom of action." Close quote. So you have the rights that it is convenient for your society for you to have at that given time. And those might not be the rights you had 20 years prior, and they might not be the same rights you have 20 years later. Now, Goodnow found it necessary to go after the idea of natural rights because he knew the idea of natural rights is the foundation for the requirement that government be based upon consent and the rule of law. This principle of government by the consent of the governed, this was a problem for Goodnow. It's a problem for those who shared his vision of administrative power. Right? You see that from the examples that I gave earlier. You see it from the discussions that came this morning. Right? How much do elections really matter anymore in this country? If you're concerned about government by the consent of the governed, this is a problem. The empowering of administrators, as the progressives saw it, was justified not because administrators had the consent of the people, but rather because the administrators were experts in their field, because they had been educated on the issues over which they were to be given regulatory power. They know better. So, Goodnow therefore wanted to improve administration, but he wanted to improve it not by making administration more accountable to the consent of the governed, but in fact by making it less accountable. Goodnow acknowledged that the doctrine of the sovereignty of the people was an integral part of the American political culture. He therefore acknowledged that this aspect of our political culture would be a bit of a difficult hurdle for his vision of administration to overcome. But Goodnow said, we have administrative experts now available. They're being educated, they're being produced by our elite universities. And he urged that they be employed and empowered with significant discretion to manage the new tasks the progressives had in mind for the national government. And so Goodnow's work, while certainly more obscure than Wilson's, in fact made its contributions to the progressive cause by thinking really in detail how our legal system, how our constitutional system would have to be changed in order to accommodate governance by bureaucratic agencies. If you think of some of Senator Lee's remarks from this morning, he talked about the Administrative Procedure Act and this whole body of law and court decisions which kind of facilitates so much independent governance by administrative agencies. Well, Frank Goodnow and the progressives are really the pioneers in those practical considerations. Right? What does our law have to look like? What kind of principles should our courts be governed by if we're going to give this greater discretion to administrative agencies? Because it doesn't come out of the Constitution, after all. If you think about the main tenets, then, of the progressive vision for administration, articulated by the likes of Wilson and Goodnow, they really have come to have a powerful influence in the administrative state by which we are governed today. Again, that can be seen, I think, just from the examples I gave, from the examples that were given earlier today. For the whole story, of course, certainly it would be necessary to examine the translation of progressive ideas into the actual reshaping of American government that took place during the New Deal of Franklin Roosevelt. And in fact, if you look at Roosevelt's remarks, many of them refer back to the progressive ideas. If you look at his 1932 Commonwealth Club address in particular, he points back to Teddy Roosevelt and especially to Wilson as sort of the intellectual foundation for the New Deal. So you'd have to look at that. That's, of course, a story that would have to wait for another day. Unless you all want to stick around after, that'd be okay too. I think for our purposes, however, today we'll simply stick to the intellectual roots of the modern bureaucracy in the progressive era, which is what I've tried to sketch here very briefly. So I'll stop. Thanks for your patience and your attention. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you for that. My name is Jay Zawatsky. I'm from Bethesda, Maryland. Have you read the book Phillip Drew, Administrator?
No, but I know of which you speak.
Okay. I read it recently, and it was written by a fellow named House, Colonel House, who I believe was the political father of Woodrow Wilson. He sort of discovered him as a politician and suggested he might be brought along to run for president. Are you familiar with that history?
Yeah, I certainly am. I mean, House, I wouldn't call him the sort of kind of political father of Wilson. He was certainly a close confidant and had, at sometimes more than others, a great deal of influence on Wilson's thinking inside the White House. It ultimately waned, but...
The reason I bring up Phillip Drew, Administrator, is because in that novel, which was written by House, he actually eviscerates the Constitution and sets up Phillip Drew, the hero, as the man on the white horse. And I was wondering if Wilson actually saw himself as the man on the white horse.
I think it's safe to say that Wilson saw himself as a man on the white horse in a lot of ways. That is to say, when I mentioned a moment ago that there's this contrast between the framers and the progressives, right? Someone like Madison says, human nature, there's this permanent self-interestedness in it, and we're always going to be factious, and while we're capable of great things and capable of governing ourselves and everything else, we're also always going to have this self-interest. It's going to be a problem in democratic government, because what do you do when a majority of people wants to take away the liberty of a minority of the people in order to benefit themselves? Wilson says, no, history's overcome that. Right? Human beings are no longer like that, or they're not nearly as much like that as they used to be. Well, one might take a look at the history. Take a look at the history of the second part of the 19th century, and you might say, politics still seems pretty self-interested, pretty corrupt, pretty factious. One of the most factious times you can think of, probably. Human beings don't seem to have lost much of their innate self-interestedness. Wilson's argument, Wilson developed then a whole argument for progressive leadership. Right? That what a progressive leader was there to do was to see past or to see through all of the typical contentions which still existed on the surface of politics, and to be able to pull out from underneath them the real unity, the real kind of togetherness, the real mind of the people that was there latent, that's there in the public mind. The real leader, to use your phrase, maybe the man on a white horse, in a way knows the mind of the people better than the people themselves. And so all of these sort of limitations and all of these, all of the ways in which the Constitution kind of carefully circumscribes the power of government because, a fear of what we might do to one another were it completely unfettered. From Wilson's point of view, a progressive leader, whom he certainly understood to be himself, could see through that and could pull out from the people the kind of unity that history had given them. And this is, by the way, not an uncommon characteristic. I mean, Teddy Roosevelt thought the same thing. And when you think about this, I'm always brought back to Madison and Federalist 10, and Madison's comment about man and the connection between his reason and his self-love. And that's when I think of Wilson or Teddy Roosevelt, that's what I think of. That I think very astute observation of Madison's. Yes, sir.
This is a question from our online viewers. Theo from Atlanta, Georgia asks, you've mentioned how the progressives had great trust in humanity. Has their belief in man's goodness been shaken by the failings of the progressive state?
The questioner seems to dare to suggest that the actual facts of history may somewhat diverge from the faith and the optimism. Look, I mean, it's ironic in a very terrible way. These notions about the sort of end of factionalism, these notions about being able to free ourselves from constraints because we're less of a danger to themselves, are all just at the beginning of the bloodiest century in human history. I think about it, and this is true, by the way, of the 19th century German thinkers who really spawned the idea of historical progress, right? The century leading into the 20th century. This is not something about which to be optimistic. Look, the idea here is to always push the goal line further ahead, right? And so the argument would be, and it is by a lot of modern-day progressives, well, we might be wrong about where the end of history comes, but we know it's coming, it's just over the horizon, or no, maybe we were wrong about it being at this point, but it's 50 years off, or whenever it is. And so the end is always, the goal is, the end zone is always pushed away. You're always in the red zone, to use a football analogy. And so, no, I don't think it dampens much enthusiasm, although there are some progressives who, through the course of the 20th century, certainly became a little bit disillusioned with progressivism as a result of historical reality. Just one quick example of that I might give, by the way. Right now, it's very hard for agencies to get away with doing anything without it being litigated by the courts. And that's the result of a phenomenon that started to take place in the 1970s called capture theory. And prior to that point in the 20th century, you had this great optimism about administrators. All we need to do is get off their backs. All we need to do is free them from control, and they'll do the right thing. And liberals themselves actually became a bit disillusioned with that, as they seem to recognize that, well, wait a minute, if you take human beings and put them into administration, they still act like human beings. They're still as self-interested as they would have been anywhere else, and they're still as self-interested as other people. And so there came along a much greater skepticism about administrators, and that's when you started getting a lot of the liberal interest groups developing and taking agencies into federal court. So you get groups like the NRDC or the Sierra Club, places like this, who would go into court and they'd say, we don't think these agencies are regulating hard enough. They're not regulating zealously enough. And so we want to use the courts to put the feet of administrators to the fire, not because of liberty reasons, but because we want more regulation than what they're giving, and they become captured by their self-interestedness. So that idea of capture theory, which is now very common in bureaucracy, is part of a disillusionment about what happens on the ground. Yes.
Yeah, my name is Brent McMahon. I'm from Potomac, Maryland. I had two questions. One, the American Revolution was a reaction to the tyranny that we lived under. One, were there no administrative despots in the world that would have served as a counter factual to the progressive ideal back then? And number two, who were the intellectual opponents, primary intellectual opponents of Wilson and those people that existed back then?
Well, your second question I'm going to take first, because it points to the problem generally. There weren't very many intellectual opponents to the progressives. So, in fact, years ago when I first started reading and writing about the progressives and teaching the progressives, I taught a course for the first time, and it's one of those new courses, so you're staying kind of a week ahead of the students, and I put a section in the course toward the end called Progressive Era Conservatives or something like that. And I figured, well, I'll put people, like I don't know, Lodge and Taft and Elihu Root and others who kind of oppose progressive policies, and I'll put them in there and sort of read about the debate that was going on. And when you read a lot of these guys, what you realize is you know why the battle was lost, because they're using progressive language. And what you see, and the more you look into it, what you discover is this stuff is in the air and it's in the water in the second half of the 19th century and at the turn of the century. The progressive mindset, this way of thinking historically about human nature and about government, it's in the air and the water, and it's in the language. And so even folks who might have opposed this or that particular policy are nonetheless of a kind of mindset. And it really reflects the extent to which the American university had been radically transformed between 1860 and 1900. Just a massive change if you look at the contrast from one point to the other. And what had happened was, at this time, if you wanted a higher degree, you went to Europe to get it. And so you had all these Americans going off to Europe and especially to Germany to get these advanced degrees. And if you were an American college or university, it became the trendy thing to do. It's what you did in order to be prestigious, to hire some of these European educated academics back onto your faculties. And so you had colleges which had been very orthodox and which still had very orthodox boards of trustees, for instance. But they thought, well, the thing to do is to get us some European, newly minted European PhDs. That's what all the elite places are doing. And so you get them in all these institutions. And this starts to filter its way down. It transforms institutions of higher education in this country. And it starts to filter its way down. And as Aristotle tells us, bad ideas at the top, they'll corrupt the regime. And it takes a long time. But in terms of the intellectual argument, then, it explains why there's very little opposition intellectually. There's some various political opposition, of course. It's why the proposals of the original progressives often didn't get very far. Had to wait for the New Deal. But there's really not serious intellectual opposition, and that's partly why. Yes, sir.
My name is David Greenberg. I'm from Statesboro, Georgia. And my question is dealing with something that Friedrich Bastiat said in his book, The Law, that misuse and use of morality serve to justify legal plunder. And I want to know if that same thing, misuse and use of morality, also helped give rise to progressivism.
Well, certainly you might say the misuse of it did. What a lot of people don't realize was that the progressive movement was intimately bound up with one of the more important religious movements of that time, the social gospel movement. What you had, I have a whole separate speech I give on social gospel, but what you had, I won't give it now, but what you had there was essentially the turning of the state into a god. And so what history is essentially God making himself manifest on earth, and the state is a kind of heaven on earth. And so for many progressives, not all of them, some were quite secularized, but for many progressives, Wilson included, there was a kind of religious fervor, and certainly a kind of sort of moral superiority, the idea that one had to read on the Holy Spirit, and history kind of embodied the Holy Spirit. So it is true, right, a misuse of morality. On the other hand, you have to understand that the idea that they were seeking to attack, seeking to replace, the idea that man has liberty, and that there is an obligation for this liberty to be protected, that's also a moral idea. All right, you can't forget that. So it's not like any assertion of morality is somehow inherently a threat to liberty. It's really in the progressive era a misuse then of morality. Yes, sir.
This will be our final question for Dr. Pestritto. It's another question from the online audience. Loretta from Akron, Ohio asks, you've shown pretty well that ideas have consequences. If progressivism and conservatism are the two battling ideals in America, how do we ensure that conservatism wins? Do we look to education or something else?
If I had the answer to that, I don't know where I'd be, but I guess I should say I do have the answer to it, and it's why I am where I am. I think the answer is in education. The answer really is contained in the response I gave to the gentleman a moment ago, that the reason why we have the problems that we have today are one of the main reasons why is because we've had bad ideas coming in and infiltrating this system now for a long time. You have to remember the fight that we are in, it's not a short-term fight. It's not going to be won in one election or two elections. It took these guys 100 years to do this. So, these ideas have been filtering down, and in my view, the way out lies in education. Until you educate different principles, then you're not going to get any kind of permanent victory. So, thank you very much. I appreciate it.